There's a curious moment that happens in almost everyone's life when you find yourself absolutely seething at someone else's behavior. Maybe it's their neediness, their aggression, their dishonesty, or their recklessness. And you stand there, convinced that this person embodies everything you despise. But here's what psychologists and philosophers have noticed for centuries. The intensity of our anger toward others is often inversely proportional to our distance from the thing they're expressing. We rage at others not because they are fundamentally different from us, but because they are expressing parts of ourselves we have systematically rejected. This is projection, and it is perhaps the most psychologically revealing phenomenon of human nature. What bothers us most in others is almost always what we've buried deepest in ourselves. Carl Jung understood this profoundly, and it led him to develop one of the most transformative concepts in psychology: the shadow. For Jung, the shadow is not the embodiment of evil. It is not something demonic lurking in your unconscious waiting to destroy you. Instead, it is something far more mundane and far more tragic. It is the repository of every trait, impulse, desire, and emotion that you decided was unacceptable during the formation of your personality. When you were a child, you learned what was rewarded and what was punished. You learned that certain expressions of yourself were met with love and others with rejection or shame. So you made a choice, often unconsciously. You kept the acceptable parts and disowned the rest. You buried your aggression to be seen as kind. You repressed your selfishness to be seen as generous. You suppressed your sexuality to be seen as pure. You denied your vulnerability to be seen as strong. These rejected pieces didn't disappear. They didn't evaporate into nothingness. They went into the shadow, that dark repository of the self that society told you to hide. But here is where it becomes urgent. The shadow doesn't stay buried. It cannot be permanently sealed away through willpower or positive thinking or spiritual bypassing. Instead, it leaks. It emerges as the passive-aggressive comment disguised as a joke. It surfaces as the self-sabotage that undermines your own success just when you're on the verge of achievement. It explodes in disproportionate rage at minor infractions. It crystallizes into obsessive judgment of others, where you become a vigilante prosecutor of exactly the flaws you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. The harder you push the shadow down, the more energy it requires, and the more distorted it becomes. Your psyche is not actually designed for this kind of internal civil war. The cost is exhaustion, internal fragmentation, and a life spent at war with yourself. This is where shadow work enters not as a trendy concept borrowed by wellness culture, but as a genuine psychological necessity. Shadow work is not about destruction. It is not about becoming a worse person by embracing your darkness. It is about integration. It means turning toward the parts of yourself you've rejected and asking a radically honest question. What is this part of me actually trying to tell me? Your dark anger isn't asking you to hurt people. It's asking you to develop boundaries. Your selfishness isn't asking you to become cruel. It's asking you to honor your own needs. Your sexuality isn't asking you to betray your values. It's asking you to reclaim your aliveness. Your aggressive impulses aren't asking you to become violent. They're asking you to channel that energy into creative expression, into competition, into standing up for what matters. Shadow work means taking these exiled parts and bringing them back into the fold, not as the dominant voice in your personality, but as contributors to a more complete self. The irony that Jung would have appreciated is that the path to wholeness requires first acknowledging that you are not whole. It requires confessing that you are fragmented, contradictory, and full of impulses that don't fit the persona you've constructed. This runs counter to everything our culture tells us about self-improvement. We are sold the myth of perfection. But perfection is actually a kind of psychological death. Wholeness is something far more interesting. It is the integration of contradiction. It is the person who is both kind and aggressive, both selfish and generous, both vulnerable and strong. and who can access each of these qualities when the moment calls for it. The human mind was never meant to be a carefully curated garden where only acceptable flowers are allowed to bloom. It was meant to be a wild forest where every impulse, every desire, every shadow has a place and a voice. When you stop fighting that wilderness within yourself, something remarkable happens. You become harder to manipulate. You become clearer about who you actually are. You become free. And that freedom is the real work.